news portion of tonight's program, we'd like to take a short break and look at our expected weather for tomorrow and then come back to continue. I'm going to be here hosting a discussion. We're looking at the subject of Egypt-Saudi relations and also continuing a series of the Holy Quran looking at Surah Al-Baqarah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hudda Tonight. This is the second segment of the program. We're going to be looking at a political subject tonight regarding two Arab countries, that is Saudi Arabia and Egypt. We are talking tonight, joined by Professor emaad.muhanna, a political science professor and also of strategic studies. Assalamu alaikum, Professor. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks to you. And we're quite happy to hear that King Salman is going to be here in Egypt very soon. So,
he's coming tomorrow, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Is this the first time since he's been?
That's right, he's been in office, and I think there's a number of issues that we're going to be touching on tonight, so I'm sure it will be interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are you going to have be in place to see him arrive?
Well, we'll try. We'll definitely try. But the most important is we see more cooperation on the economic side and also on the national security, the Arab national security side. And also, have a unity in terms of points of view, because sometimes these can drive quite a lot the nation to the better.
Let's go back in history to the formation of these two countries in modern times.
Yeah.
I think this takes us back to the 1920s or 30s or so?
That's right. The Ottoman Empire basically was totally broken or divided. That time officially, and in 1923, and then from there the predecessors remained in Egypt, King Fuad and Farouk in Egypt as the end of the empire, and then with the 1952 revolution basically that ended the Ottoman Empire rule in Egypt completely. During that time there's some movements in Saudi Arabia, but the actual relationship goes way thousands of years.
Okay.
We must say that, because if we go back to Prophet Abraham, basically lived here in Egypt in an area called Ain Shams or Heliopolis. That's what it's called. It's called Ain Shams. And his first wife, Sarah, basically wasn't, didn't give him kids, so he got married to Hajar, and that's an Egyptian woman. So Prophet Ibrahim married to an Egyptian woman, and she's the mother of Ismail. So Ismail is actually half Egyptian, Prophet Ibrahim's son. And they always say that the Copts or the ancient Egyptians are the uncles of the Arabs twice. The first one was Prophet Ibrahim when he got married to an Egyptian named Hagar, and he got his son Ismail, and Ismail became the father of the Arab. And in the second time, Prophet Muhammad got married to Maria, who was a gift from Muqawqis, the ruler of Egypt at the time of the Prophet, and he gifted Maria as basically a slave to him, and he married Maria and got his son Ibrahim. So that's how the relationship goes way back thousands of years.
I just want to ask a clarifying question. In the Torah or the Old Testament, the Jews describe Ibrahim as the father of the Jews.
No, he's the father of both, the Jews and the Arabs. Jacob's is the father of Jews, but Ismail is the father of the Arabs. That's why they call the Arabs and the Jews are cousins. That's where it comes from. Ibrahim basically came from an area in Iraq. That's where it started, and then he came to Egypt. He lived in Egypt a few years, and then when he was instructed by God to go to Mecca and start a life there, and we know from there Safa, Marwa, and all that walk, and the delivery of Ismail. So Ismail's mother is Egyptian.
And he has a very special place next to the Kaaba, is that right?
That's right. That's where the Safa and Marwa is, where the and Zamzam, basically, the well. So what we're trying to say is that the relationship goes all the way back.
Yeah.
It's a blood ethnicity ties between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And let me tell you that Muhanna is a Saudi tribe. It's not an Egyptian tribe. So my name is actually, I'm from a Saudi tribe in Hijaz area, and that part of the family, Muhanna, migrated to Egypt during the Crusade. When Salah ad-Din basically formed the army from the different Arab countries and started to fight Richard the Lion's Heart, a lot of Saudis migrated from Saudi Arabia to Egypt.
To help fight
to fight
the Crusades.
The Crusades. So Muhanna is one of the families that came. Part of it is still in Saudi Arabia, and part is in Egypt, and some of them actually spread around, you know, across the Middle East. So the relationship goes all the way back. In terms of modern relationships and agreements, the first agreement that was signed between Egypt and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was in 1926.
1926, okay.
Yeah, that's immediately after the empire collapsed, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. From that time, Egypt was still under the British rule, because Egypt officially became independent in 1936, yet the British remained. But officially Egypt in 1936 became an independent country. But they remained in Egypt, the British, until 1952, and Saudi Arabia supported the withdrawal of the British troops from Egypt in 1952, in addition to the Ottoman Empire remains, which was King Farouk, who gone back to Turkey. And from that time, the relationship between Egypt and Saudi Arabia on one side and Turkey on the other side became very sensitive. In 1952, the first agreement of joint defense between Egypt and Saudi Arabia was signed in 1952. From that, we started to see a lot of political, economic, social, and cultural ties between the two countries. And we could see that quite clearly in 1973 war, where King Faisal stood and stopped supplying oil, which basically helped Egypt quite a lot in the war against Israel. And from that point, I think the conspiracy on the new, on the Middle East to create the new Middle East basically started after 1973 with the assassination of King Faisal, and then from there, all assassinations up until 1981, assassination of Sadat in 1981.
What was
so that was part of the conspiracy, because King Faisal and Sadat managed to create stronger ties than before, and basically controlling natural resources such as oil and gas. Between the two of them, managed to create a nation. Before that, we could see, yes, in 1945, we could see the establishment of the Arab League. But as we talked about in different episodes, definitely it wasn't really strong. But definitely there was a strong ties between Egypt and Saudi Arabia on the national security preservations. We've seen during President Nasser the involvement of Egypt in 1962 war in Yemen, which was very similar to what we have now. So we always say that history repeats itself. That 1962 crisis in Yemen, very similar to what we have in the Houthis now.
Yeah.
Same involvement, ground troops, but it was a mess, because Egypt lost about 220,000 soldiers in there. It was a second Vietnam.
That's very significant.
Yeah. It was a second Vietnam, totally a mess on Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Was Iran involved in that in '62?
Not during that time, because Iran and Egypt had a very good relationship during that time, up until 1979.
Right, because there was a marriage between one of the princes of Egypt.
That's right. Shah got married to King Fuad's daughter. So there was definitely a blood ties in there. But Shah, when the revolution basically started by Khomeini, Shah asked for political refugee in Egypt. That was in 1979, and he died and got buried here in Egypt. He's buried here, and since that time, since 1979-80, the relationship between Egypt and Iran became very bad, because Egypt hosted the Shah against whom the revolution really
Right.
commenced.
Right.
At the same time, Egypt, as a major player, didn't want to turn him back to Khomeini. And that really became, the trigger for all escalations that we see at this point.
I want to go back to 73. You said that Saudi Arabia was supplying fuel to Egypt in their conflict with Israel. Were they also supplying weapons?
No. There was a lot of support, financial support during the war, but the major part that King Faisal, God bless him, during that time is stopped supplying oil to Europe and to United States to put pressure on Israel to withdraw. So the pressure that he put on them has really helped Egypt on the political negotiations. On the negotiation table, because on the ground level there was a fight, and if you look at 1973 war, the entire war was 19 days. It was just one hit, done, and then start a negotiation. So oil played a major role in there, and we also know in history that King Faisal turned some of the ships that were carrying oil to Europe, turned them back to Egypt and stopped supplying. So he really stood strongly during the war, and I think the conspiracy against the Arab nation started with him in the assassination, and then Sadat in 1981. So from that time we've seen development in different areas of cooperation, from the political to economic to cultural, etc. Up until 1962, the cover of Mecca itself, the Kaaba, the cover used to come from Egypt, because the Egyptians had, all the way back, knew how to do it, the sewing, etc.
It used to be white, I understand. It wasn't always
white,
black.
but it's always inlaid with gold. But still in the castle of Muhammad Ali, the castle of Salahuddin, where the mosque of Muhammad Ali is in the old Cairo, the last cover is still there. And that was returned in 1962 when the war erupted in Yemen. So the cover was sent back, and from that time Saudi Arabia started to make its own cover. But up until 1961, the cover used to come from Egypt. So we've seen a lot of ties. At this point, I think Saudi Arabia has played a major role, not just in the 70s, during the 80s, 90s, and the last 15, 20 years on the economic side. We talk probably about 3,229 companies investing in Egypt, over $9 billion. Saudi companies, over $9 billion basically at this point. In total, they reached about 118 billion Egyptian pounds at some point. After the revolution and the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, a lot of these investments exit Egypt, and some of these investments turned to other activities like properties, for example. So it wasn't really focused on production. So there was a major shift in the actual investment, wasn't in the production cycle, which really hammered the Egyptian economy, because property in the end is not a production. So, and that's understandable because of the security of these monies. We're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood over a year, and before that a chaos for about 2.5 years. So at this point, I think the Saudi investment totaling about 6 billion at this point, carrying out a lot of activities in the production sphere. In return, Egyptian companies have a lot of investment in Saudi Arabia when it comes to services particularly. And also you talk about 3 million Egyptian workers that work in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia hosts about 45% of the Egyptian labor in the Gulf region. Just in Saudi Arabia.
I want to mention, you're talking about current relations.
Yeah.
I think it was a couple years ago, we saw the first time ever an incident where the Saudi government extradited members of the Muslim Brotherhood back to Egypt.
That's right.
That was very historic, because it was the first time we saw that in the Arab world.
When the Muslim Brotherhood started, it was a chaos, because they started to step on everybody's toes. They started to criticize and sometimes insult the authorities in Emirates and Saudi Arabia, so they damaged a lot of relationships during that time. And I think it was understandable that the support for Egypt becomes less, very understandable. And we also talked about the reduction in investment coming from Saudi Arabia to Egypt during that time was little. At this point, President Sisi is trying to renew that relationship. We still have some difference in point of view, where sometimes we hear in the newspaper or we see in the newspaper about some tension here and there, but it's not really a tension, it's just a point of view that's slightly different regarding some cases, and we'll talk about them separately. But in the end, what we're talking about here is a strength in the Arab nationalism. The new generations are really started to revitalize the vision of Nasser, the rebuilding of the Arab nationalism.
Pan-Arab.
Exactly. So the unity of the Arab, and that's where power is. If you get all the Arabs, the 23 countries, combined, the army with weapons is the second in the world. So you can actually have a confederation or a federal rule among the Arab nations, even if you do it under the Arab League, as we talked before. You're definitely going to be the strongest economic power in the world, the second largest army in the world. So there is a lot to be done. But I think here the focus is on Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the two sides to the relationship of the Arab nation overall, and not just the Arab nation, but you're talking about 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide.
Is it fair to say that Saudi Arabia and Egypt are two, among the Arab nations, are two of the most important, and if so, why?
They are the most important in terms of population and in terms of the credibility and strength as an image, as a importance to the Arab nation and to the Muslim world. If you look at Islam, for example, you've got Mecca, you've got Medina, and you've got Al-Azhar. So you've got the ritual side and you've got the scientific side. So Al-Azhar always the minaret of Islam worldwide. And it's been like that over 1,000 years. When Amr ibn al-As entered Egypt and built Al-Azhar Mosque and became the first university in the world as Al-Azhar al-Sharif. So you're talking about the scientific drive that drives and represents Islam in a good way, or create the good image of Islam, was in Al-Azhar, and you've got the ritual side in Saudi Arabia. So the two sides here are complementing each other. Adding to that, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, adding to that Palestine, those are the triangle of prophets.
I was waiting for Al-Aqsa to come in.
Yeah, so the triangle of prophets. So there is a lot of ties in here. If you talk about Ibrahim, for example, his Ismail, his son, is half Egyptian. If you talk about Joseph, he lived in Egypt. If you talk about Moses, he lived in Egypt. If you talk about Prophet Muhammad and the other prophets were in different areas of the Arab Peninsula.
Came
and exactly.
For a while.
Jesus was here in Egypt as well, and he was born in Palestine. So that's a triangle. So these countries, these three countries, and on top of that, you get Palestine, unfortunately occupied, but those are the three angles of Islam, if you like, and falls under that the Arab nationalism. So at this point, we've got one angle broken, which is the occupation of beloved Palestine. So you've got the two sides, and always the Arabs and the Muslims are always attaching themselves to these two. So if these two collapse, the entire Arab world and the Muslim nation is totally gone. It's totally lost. And therefore you always find conspiracies around damaging, and the new Middle East, for example, is always revolving around the Red Sea, because there's one side Saudi Arabia and the other side is Egypt. And that's where the Arabs and Muslims should be very careful when it comes to these two. And therefore I think there's always, it's a God's gift. There's always that wisdom of leaders that try to resolve issues before they escalate.
Can we look at more areas of cooperation? You've touched a lot on the political and the economic. What about some other areas?
We've got on the cultural side, there is a lot of cooperation, education. As we said, we've got about 3 million workers in Saudi Arabia, you know, ranging from sweepers to professors in different areas. You've got certain areas or certain fields that are almost 90% Egyptian workers in certain fields, like in trade and management. In education, definitely over 85% Egyptians. So the fact here is there is a lot of interdependence, if you like.
Okay.
Egypt is regarded one of the highest nations in exporting labor. So you're talking about an excess of about 7 million Egyptians. 3 of them are in Saudi Arabia. Iraq, before the second Iraq war, even during the Iraqi-Irani war, there were 6 million Egyptians in Iraq. So you're talking about a large number of labor that basically provides that supply. So you get that kind of a marriage or a ties between the labor force and the capital, which are the two sides that you need, plus land to build economies. Land, labor, and capital. And this is where it is an advantage to the Arab nation that some of the countries have the labor, some have the land, and some have the capital. And this is where, you know, the cooperation can be quite easy, but it needs a political will.
Can you talk about security? I mean, we in recent times have talked about this Islamic military coalition led by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Right. Can we say that?
Definitely, if you, let's go back a little bit, because the cooperation military or the national security protection in the you know, the defense agreement started in 1955. From that, you see the war in 1956, the nationalization of the Suez Canal. There was a Saudi support, and from there we started to see a cooperation also in liberation in a lot of other countries, like in 1958, Algeria, for example. In 62, that's where some damage happened in the relationship because of Yemen. In 1962, Yemen was the main problem that created some sort of a tension and aggression between Egypt and Saudi Arabia that was resolved afterwards. And then in 1967, we saw the Zionism attack on Sinai and Golan Heights in Syria. And this is where we found, again, cooperation started to get stronger. But because of the occupation of Sinai, there was some sort of isolation between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. That gap was created. And from there, the support continued until 1973. And we talked about the cooperation in 1973 when it comes to oil, when it comes to buying weapons, when it comes to cooperation, blocking Aden Passage, the Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, controlling basically the trade in the Red Sea. There was a lot of cooperation and intelligence work between the two countries. I think the national security protection and the agreement for self-protection and cooperation on defense came out quite clear in the second Gulf War in 1990. Where Egypt had to basically adhere to the agreement. So they sent in the Desert Storm, Egypt sent basically the strongest troop in the entire Egyptian army wasn't there, and it's classified number 4 in the world.
Under the Operation Desert Storm?
That's right. Egypt had, in the Desert Storm, was actually the location of the Egyptian troops. From that, they remained over 2 years in Saudi Arabia to secure the area, and still, as President Sisi said, it's just a matter of a distance. Whenever one of the Arab brothers need any assistance.
Do we know what the Egyptian forces were doing in Saudi? Were they directly confronting Iraqi?
To basically look at how they split it, because some of the troops moved from Iraq in the east to Kuwait in the west. The plan was to split the two troops into two halves or two sides. The Arab troops were in the middle, the Moroccans, the Syrians, the Saudis, and the Egyptians in the middle. Americans, all they do and all they can do is just attack by air force. That's all they can do, and eat chocolate. So they were using F-16 to basically bomb all locations, and we've seen they damaged the infrastructure. And intentionally saying that because after the second Gulf War,
I have to disagree. It was the French. I was there, and we didn't have a lot, but the French soldiers did have chocolate.
Okay. So the infrastructure of Iraq was totally damaged in that war. So if we're talking about splitting the troops, that was the aim behind putting the Arab troops in that, because it's the most difficult. And the aim here was strategic, is to reduce the number of confrontation. Why? Because the Arabs will surround to each other. So when you split the troops, Kuwait from Iraq, the Iraqi troops that were surrounded by 45 countries, they can only surround themselves to the Arabs. They won't surround themselves to the Europeans.
Surrender.
Surrender. So basically, in that surrender, that area was absolutely strategic for the Arabs, and that was the aim behind putting the Arabs on those areas, and that reduced dramatically the number of people that were basically killed in that war. The aim here in the end is to create that withdrawal. But again, part of the conspiracy that Saddam didn't listen, and he lost a large portion of his troops in there. From that time, I think the defense between, or joint defense between Egypt and Saudi Arabia became stronger. The threat became more.
There was a significant, I guess we can say, a rift in the Arab League over Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. That, for example, Yasser Arafat in Palestine supported Hussein.
That's right.
But because of that, I mean, all were not in agreement with the Saudi opening its borders to foreign troops.
That's right. It was really a contradiction, major contradiction, because number one, people that actually don't agree with what Saddam did said, well, let's use the Arabs to create that withdrawal, or let's not bring foreign troops into the scene. That's number one. Number two, if you look at reality, you can't do that because you don't have actual strong armies to take them out. So you need the foreign troops. That was one of the problems.
And the Saudis were also, as you said earlier,
they were
concerned.
Worried. They were worried because
Iraq would
the only army you have in there is the Egyptians. And if you get and it was good. I think it was wise of Mubarak to allow the foreign troops, for one thing, because the Egyptian army would have been totally gone into a direct confrontation with the Iraqis, and it became a hell of a war between the two armies, because they're almost the same level, and you're going to be losing a lot of people. And Saudi Arabia is in the middle. Just to clarify that, the devil that whispered into his ears basically was some people, politicians, whether the American ambassador or even King Hussein. And I'm sorry to say that, but he allowed
Jordan.
Yes, the king of Jordan. He basically supported Saddam Hussein to go in there. And let me tell you how the plan, because the plan was actually explained to Egypt. The plan was to create an Arab empire. And what Saddam basically was trying to convince Mubarak to do is that Iraq will take the northern part, taking Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and all the Gulf states, and Egypt will meet him from the south and create an empire on the expense of the Gulf states.
Very bold plan, yeah.
Exactly. So King Hussein supported that. Yasser Arafat supported that because it creates a world war in there. So in the middle, he can take part of Palestine at least. And we've got to be always, objectives, because we here carry the oath to be honest. And I think it was totally planned wrong, because you can't murder under, with an intention to create a unity of the Muslim world or the Arabs. So the plan was totally rejected by Mubarak, and from that time Mubarak basically said, I'm not going to get involved in that. When Egypt withdrew from that deal or refused it, King Hussein withdrew and Yasser Arafat withdrew, so Saddam suddenly found himself alone. And because he you know, God help him now, he was a bit arrogant, so he didn't want to go back. And the fact here is, it was a setup to destroy the Iraqi army, and he swallowed the bait. That was the problem, and
so
from
this feeds into the new Middle East.
New Middle East, absolutely. It was this whole plan, but the problem is, and we've probably talked about that, is that we need cultured nations. We need people that understand how the world works. And remember, we talked about the Russian movements in the Middle East, and we always say, well, Russians are our friends now. Nobody's your friend. It's all about mutual benefits. Russia will sell you when you don't have something that they can benefit from. We've got to understand that. So the fact here is, Saddam went into Kuwait, suddenly found himself alone. The damage is already done. So he couldn't really go back on it, and that's the damage. We lost the army, the 8th army in the world at the time, totally lost. Total damage to the infrastructure of Iraq. Now we've got 5-6 million people drinking water from a sewage. You've got now a nation that is displaced. Same thing that happened in Libya. We always swallow the bait. It's our fault. And despite the fact that we had, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood, but it was a good exercise, if you like, because we learned from it. What we have at this point, and here we will see this some sort of or kind of a tension between Saudi Arabian point of view and Egyptian point of view around Syria. There isn't any tension between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It's just a different point of view.
Yeah, I want to ask you, what kinds of, I haven't seen much media on this. What have they said is on their agenda? What do they plan to discuss?
Well, the visit of King Salman is basically to discuss a number of areas. On the political sphere, you've got the problem in Yemen and the restoration
It's been a year.
The
it's been over a year now.
Yeah, the legitimate government. We've seen now a lot of appointments taking place in Yemen, so it's going back well. There is some areas still that might require ground work, military side. In Yemen? But that's an issue that needs to be discussed. The second issue is the threat of Iran and involvement in threatening the Arab national security. That's the second issue. The third issue is the situation in Libya, because terrorism in Libya and the expansion of Daesh in Libya basically threatens Egypt, and if it reaches Egypt, it's already in Saudi Arabia. So you always get that in mind. The fourth and the most important factor is the Syrian crisis. At this point, the war in Syria is creating a lot of displacements. You're probably talking about 3.5 million now fled to Europe. Egypt, I think, has got over 250,000. A lot of problems in there. Saudi Arabia probably thinks that Bashar should step down. Egypt thinks that if Bashar steps down, Syria will be divided.
It's too late for him to leave now.
Exactly. So this is really a point of view. Whether Egypt is right or Saudi Arabia is right, I think they're going to have to rework this out, because in the end, this is what happened in Iraq. When Saddam was captured, Iraq is gone. Gaddafi, despite their problems.
Yeah.
We're not saying they're right.
The country fell.
The country fell because it's got leadership, and the problem in Syria is going to be worse than Libya because it's ethnicity.
Why did it take the Saudi king so long to come?
And to Egypt?
Yeah.
No. There's always communications. There's always communication. In April, I think it will be on the 12th of April. That will be the summit. So the summit is coming. So there will be a lot. So I think the summit will have a lot of issues to discuss. And my expectation on the political sphere, this is going to be a preparation for what to put forward on the table.
Okay.
On the economic side, I think a lot of cooperation and investment, because Egypt at this point is in major economic crisis, and I think Saudi Arabia.
We got 2 minutes left, Professor. How would you like to?
I think the main thing that Saudi Arabia is focusing on at this point, and we've got to be realistic strategically. If Egypt collapses economically, it's going to be a problem for everybody. So I think King Salman understands that and is trying to really inject the country with investment. But I think the problem here is on the Egyptian government side. There's a lot of corruption. So far, I think the Egyptian government got about $23 billion from the Gulf states. We haven't seen any development. So we've got a high corruption rate in Egypt, but unfortunately he can't turn his back. This is what he sees as his message. So he announced that he will inject into Egypt an investment that exceeds about 30 billion riyals.
One last note before we close out. We've been seeing in recent months the Egyptian government name new projects after King Salman.
That's right.
A new municipality. Yeah. And 2 weeks ago, there was another...
These hospitals and these universities in Sinai, there's a lot of initiatives, but in the end, I don't think Egypt will be able to obtain what they obtained from King Zayed, Sheikh Zayed bin Khalifa of Emirates, because the time is different. At this point, there is major economic and financial crisis worldwide.
And so the Egyptian pound is dropping.
Exactly, it's dropping. So you're talking about 10.5 in the black market, about 9 in the bank. So there is major economic crisis. At the same time, you've got to keep the economy going to support military operations. This is the problem. And you are surrounded by terrorism everywhere. So it is a chaos. What we need is a political will, brave leaders that have vision and unite the Arabs. That's the only way forward.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for being with us. We will take a short break and then come back for segment 3. If you're going to be with us, please open your Qur'ans to the second surah, that is Al-Baqarah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the third segment of Hada tonight. And we're going to be opening Surah Al-Baqarah, inshallah. We're joined by Brother Mustafa Abdul Qayyum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, brother. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also Brother Luqman Hakim is joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam.
We are going to be looking at ayats 50 to 54 if you'd like to follow us in your Qur'ans. Brother Mustafa, please recite for us these ayats.
Thank you very much, brother. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان